I never thought it was possible to feel so utterly invisible. But that morning, when I woke up in the hospital with tubes snaking under my skin and doctors whispering urgent instructions, I realized I was alone in a way I'd never known before. My car crash had left me pinned beneath twisted metal, barely clinging to consciousness until an ambulance rushed me to the emergency room. The surgeon said I was lucky to be alive, but it didn't feel that way. When I opened my eyes, expecting to see my parents, I found only a nurse with a clipboard. I learned from that nurse that my parents were too busy to come. Apparently, my brother Jonathan was about to receive a prestigious academic award at his university, and they had chosen to attend his ceremony instead of staying by my side. I'll never forget the chill that wrapped itself around my heart when she said, in a polite, hushed tone, "They did ask how you were." It wasn't anger that I felt in that moment. It was a kind of emptiness that settled in, a shock that threatened to swallow me whole. I lay there, cold and profoundly alone. For years, Jonathan had been the favored child, intelligent, charismatic, and ambitious. He was the rising star our parents pointed to whenever they wanted to show off. People said he had a brilliant mind for business, though I never quite understood his knack for sealing deals. There were times I suspected he cut corners to get ahead, but I kept my suspicions to myself. Meanwhile, I was just the steady, reliable sibling who didn't cause trouble or need the spotlight. I worked hard, paid my rent, and tried to keep my life in order, never asking for special treatment. I felt expendable. So when the nurse told me my parents were at Jonathan's ceremony, I wasn't surprised, but I was deeply hurt. My body was bruised, stitched, and incredibly fragile, yet they were more concerned about taking photos of my brother receiving a plaque. In the days that followed, as I recovered in the hospital, I waited for them to visit. They sent one bouquet of flowers with a perfunctory "get well soon" card, but they never showed up in person. My phone stayed silent. Each ring I hoped was them, but it was usually a coworker checking on me or a distant cousin. Finally, I left the hospital, bandaged ribs and all, to start a slow and painful recovery at home. Despite being physically weak, I made a vow to myself. I would no longer chase after people who couldn't be bothered to stand with me at my worst. Every day, I forced myself to shuffle around my small apartment, enduring the aches in my muscles. My best friend Sarah brought groceries and helped me set up my medication schedule. But my parents? They texted me a single shallow message. "Hope you're feeling better soon. Keep us updated." That was the extent. Pathetic. Exactly 1 month after I was discharged, Jonathan was arrested. The news reached me through a mutual acquaintance who asked if I had heard about my brother's fraud charges. I almost dropped my phone. I imagined Jonathan's confident grin replaced by a mugshot. Apparently, his business ventures weren't as legitimate as he made them out to be. I heard that he'd scammed investors out of large sums, promising miraculous returns that never materialized. The police had evidence of falsified documents, hidden accounts, and a trail of duped victims. It all sounded like a twisted plot from a soap opera. Unbelievable. Within hours, my phone started buzzing incessantly. I recognized my mother's number first, then my father's. I let the calls go to voicemail. I knew exactly why they were calling. Jonathan's bail was set astronomically high, and he needed a lawyer with serious clout. The reality was that I had become more financially stable than my brother, partly due to living modestly and partly due to my job that offered a steady income. My parents likely assumed I'd rush to the family's rescue. Perhaps they believed that, despite their indifference toward me, I would remain the dutiful child after all. I didn't pick up. Instead, I listened to their voicemails. My mother's voice trembled with desperation. She said Jonathan was being held in a detention center and the family's reputation was at stake. My father's voicemail was more direct, demanding that I step up and do what was necessary to protect our name. Neither of them asked about my health or my recovery. They didn't apologize for abandoning me. They simply assumed I would forget the hospital bed I lay in, alone, while they applauded Jonathan on stage. Their pleas and excuses merged into a background hum of entitlement. Patronizing. They told me the situation was dire. Jonathan's bail amount was staggering, and legal fees would accumulate faster than they could manage. My father mumbled something about the family name being dragged through the mud if Jonathan remained behind bars. My mother chimed in, tears welling up in her eyes, talking about how we should stick together as a family in times of crisis. I stood there, silent, letting them talk themselves in circles. My ribcage still ached from my injuries, a grim reminder of how I'd been left to fend for myself when I needed them most. Never again. When they paused, I asked them one question. "Where were you when I was in the hospital?" My mother began to speak, but her words died in her throat. My father tried to rationalize, saying that Jonathan's award ceremony was a once-in-a-lifetime event, and they hadn't realized the severity of my condition. Lies. The doctors had told them plainly that I'd nearly died. They chose a ceremony over my survival. A tight fury coiled in my chest, and for the first time in my life, I felt no guilt for confronting them. I wanted to see them squirm. They deserved it. My father's face twitched. My mother looked down, unable to maintain eye contact. They began spewing half-baked apologies, offering every excuse under the sun for their absence. Work obligations, financial stress, confusion about my prognosis, none of it mattered. The more they talked, the more I realized how hollow their justifications sounded. I could practically see the desperation in their eyes, a fear that I might refuse them. And I'll admit, I was tempted to slam the door in their faces. But some part of me craved a kind of retribution far more tangible than simple rejection. They owed me everything. I pretended to be sympathetic. I offered them tea, watched them struggle to sip it politely, and asked about the details of Jonathan's case. My mother, spotting a glimmer of hope, explained that his court date was looming and the legal fees alone would exceed 6 figures. She looked at me expectantly. My father spoke of potential loan options and how the banks were hesitant to lend under the circumstances. They needed a co-signer, someone with a clean record and stable income. His voice shook slightly, betraying the pride he had to swallow just to ask me. I felt powerful. In that moment, I decided to lead them on, to watch as they squirmed under the weight of their requests. I told them I'd consider helping, but first, I needed a few days to consult with my financial advisor, an invented person I conjured just to make them sweat. They thanked me profusely, relief momentarily brightening their expressions. Then they left, quieter than they'd arrived, promising to call me the next day. After I closed the door, I stood there for a long time, heart pounding. For once, the scales of power had tipped in my favor, and it felt righteous. Over the following week, I received frantic texts and calls, each more urgent than the last. My mother's messages became tearful, apologetic, and my father's turned almost pleading. They mentioned how Jonathan was suffering in custody, how this ordeal could ruin his future, how families should stand together. I told them I needed more time, citing complicated bank procedures and the involvement of a lawyer friend. In reality, I was taking pleasure in watching their facade crumble. This was the same couple who hadn't bothered to see me in the hospital. Now they were practically on their knees. I reveled. Meanwhile, I quietly visited a lawyer myself, not to help Jonathan, but to ensure my own finances remained safe from any potential fallout. I learned that my brother's scheme had ensnared dozens of victims, and the evidence against him was robust. The best he could hope for was a plea deal. Even so, my parents seemed to believe that if we threw enough money at the problem, it would magically disappear. The arrogance was astounding. I, however, had no intention of sinking my hard-earned savings into a bottomless pit of legal trouble. My mind was already concocting another plan. Perfect. Revenge had never been my default setting, but their betrayal transformed something inside me. I wanted them to pay for what they did, for how they treated me like an afterthought. So I devised a strategy that would protect me financially and leave them with a grim realization of their neglect. I told my parents I was willing to offer them a loan, but on one condition. They had to sign a legal document stating that, should Jonathan lose his case, I would be absolved of any obligation to continue payments. It was a safety net for me, pure and simple. They hesitated, but desperation overrode their pride. My father tried to haggle the terms, but I stood firm. I watched the flicker of defeat cross his face when he realized I wouldn't budge. My mother said nothing, merely biting her lip. When they finally agreed, I had my lawyer draft the papers. In the meantime, Jonathan remained in custody, each passing day intensifying their anxiety. Whenever they pressed for a faster resolution, I shrugged, telling them legal work couldn't be rushed. Internally, I savored every moment. It felt like a measured dose of justice, and I was administering it. So satisfying. At last, the day came when I presented them with the finalized documents. The agreement detailed the sum I was loaning for Jonathan's bail and legal fees. It also clearly stated that if he was found guilty, or if additional charges surfaced, I could withdraw any remaining funds without further liability. They looked uneasy, but signed anyway. Soon after, I arranged for part of the bail to be paid. My father and mother thanked me profusely, insisting that once Jonathan was cleared, he'd repay everything. I just nodded, concealing my knowledge that his innocence was almost impossible to prove. Delusional. Jonathan was released on bail. For a brief moment, my parents seemed to believe their nightmare was ending. They insisted on a family dinner, likely to display unity. I agreed to meet them at a local restaurant. Jonathan arrived wearing a grim expression, but still tried to maintain his trademark swagger. His eyes flicked to me with a mixture of resentment and gratitude. He mumbled a thank you, which I acknowledged with a curt nod. Throughout dinner, he insisted he was innocent, that this was all a misunderstanding. I said little, letting him spin whatever story helped him sleep. I was unmoved. A few weeks later, his trial began. The prosecution presented reams of evidence, forged signatures, doctored financial statements, emails that contradicted his claims. I sat in the courtroom, silent, while my parents wrung their hands. Jonathan squirmed on the stand, offering excuses that rang hollow. His high-priced attorney tried to poke holes in the evidence, but the facts were damning. Halfway through the trial, whispers about a plea deal circulated. My parents looked stricken. I kept my composure, remembering the protective clause in my loan agreement. If Jonathan agreed to plead guilty, I wouldn't lose another cent. And I relished. Jonathan ultimately took the plea. The judge gave him several years of prison time, citing the gravity of his offenses. My parents were devastated, their golden boy reduced to an inmate. On the day the sentence was announced, my mother broke down in the courthouse hallway, sobbing uncontrollably. My father stood rigid, as though he couldn't believe how far we'd fallen. I, however, felt strangely calm. The loan agreement went into effect, and I withdrew the remaining funds from the bail account. Legally, I was no longer obligated to pay another dime, and my parents' last hope evaporated. Justice served. My parents confronted me afterward, accusing me of betrayal for cutting off the money. I asked them if they remembered how they abandoned me in the hospital. Their silence spoke volumes. My father tried to argue that Jonathan's future was at stake, that we couldn't just give up on him, but I reminded him that they had given up on me long ago. I watched them struggle with the truth. The only child who could have saved them from financial ruin was the same one they had cast aside. Their pleas and protests melted into angry, frustrated stammers. No sympathy. I walked away, leaving them to face the consequences of their choices. Over the next few months, I focused on my physical rehabilitation. I went to therapy sessions to deal with the emotional wounds, both from the car accident and from years of feeling overlooked. Gradually, I regained my strength, found solace in my friendships, and rebuilt a life that no longer revolved around winning my parents' approval. From time to time, they'd attempt contact, usually in the form of guilt-laden messages. They'd mention Jonathan's incarceration, the financial burdens, how the community whispered about our fractured family. I ignored them, completely. Jonathan wrote to me from prison once, a letter dripping with self-pity. He blamed the system, blamed his associates, even blamed our parents for pressuring him into success. Not once did he acknowledge his wrongdoing or express remorse for the victims he swindled. It was typical Jonathan, always someone else's fault. I considered writing back, telling him exactly what I thought, but in the end, I decided silence was the most fitting response. My absence in his life, like my parents' absence in mine when I needed them, felt like the ultimate statement. I simply let him languish, in deserved solitude. Life moved on. My scars slowly faded, and I returned to work with a renewed sense of determination. I poured my energy into my career, mindful of maintaining my personal boundaries. I vowed never again to let anyone reduce me to a footnote in my own life. Sarah remained a constant support, reminding me that not all relationships were doomed to fail. She helped me see that I was worth more than the scraps of affection my parents had doled out. With time, my anger cooled, transforming into a quiet resolve. I would never forget, and I would never forgive. Eventually, word spread that my parents were struggling financially. They had poured a lot of money into Jonathan's failed ventures and the partial bail amount. Creditors hounded them, and their home risked foreclosure. I heard they tried to sell heirlooms to stay afloat. Their once proud faces now bore the weight of continuous worry. A distant cousin mentioned they were considering moving to a smaller place. But I felt no pity. Every time I thought about their hardship, I remembered that cold hospital room where I lay broken and alone. Their predicament felt like karmic balance, finally setting things right. Inevitably, one afternoon, my mother appeared at my doorstep. Her eyes were swollen from crying, her hair unkempt. She looked nothing like the composed woman I once knew. She asked if we could talk, and for reasons I can't fully explain, I let her in. She spoke of regret, of how she wished they'd made different choices. She begged me to consider helping them one more time, promising that they'd never forget my kindness. I stared at her, recalling how she'd seemed so aloof when I needed her most. I told her calmly that I was done sacrificing my well-being. Period. There was no outburst from her, no dramatic wailing. Instead, she simply closed her eyes, nodded once, and left. Perhaps she finally understood the depth of the damage, or maybe she was just too exhausted to fight. Either way, I felt no compulsion to comfort her. I had given enough of myself for a family that valued my brother's accolades over my survival. That day, I stood by the window, watching her figure retreat until she disappeared from sight. A strange stillness followed, a moment of clarity in which I realized I owed them absolutely nothing. That liberation felt intoxicating. And so I continued living, forging my own path without the burden of their expectations. I visited the place where my car crash had happened, standing on the roadside to reflect on the twist of fate that nearly claimed my life. In a way, that accident saved me. It forced me to see my parents for who they truly were. Standing there, I whispered a silent vow to never again accept less than I deserved. My brother sat in prison, my parents grappled with regret, and I carried on, finally free. Betrayal had hardened me, but it also set me free.